This week's episode is brought to you by World Land Trust. They're a conservation charity that has been protecting the world's most biologically significant and threatened habitats for more than 35 years. As we all face up to the consequences of climate change, it can be hard to know how to be part of the solution. But with World Land Trust, you can take action. Its project Buy an Acre gives you the power to take a practical step to steer the world away from irreversible harm. For each £100 donated by our listeners, one of World Land Trust's partners will buy an acre of land under threat of deforestation. And once safely purchased, the land will be restored and conserved in cooperation with local communities. Already, with the support of people like you, Buy an Acre has bought and protected over 3.3 million acres of land worldwide. So join World Land Trust now and start saving land and species, acre by acre. You can find out more at worldlandtrust.org. It's the week ending Friday the 3rd of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a suspect shot dead after an attack outside a Manchester synagogue, Sir Keir Starmer taking aim at Reform UK in his speech at the Labour Party conference, and the death of conservationist Dame Jane Goodall at the age of 91. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me as ever from the Week's digital team, we have Harriet Marsden, and from the Week Junior, senior editor Felicity Capon. But sitting in for Jamie this week from daily history podcast, A Day in History with the Retrospectors. It's excellent. Try it. It's Arion McNicoll. And everybody, in memory of Jane Goodall's work, what's your favourite monkey?
Bonobo.
Oh, yes, a bonobo is a good one.
Yeah, and a little baby's just been born. The only bonobo in the UK has just been born. It's so cute.
Good fact.
Nothing really competes, though, with squirrel and spider monkeys, who I must confess I can't even tell the difference between them, but they're just both mischievous little so-and-sos who are hilarious to watch at the zoo, and I can't go past them.
Felicity, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The small country making Putin squirm.
The final results are yet to be presented by electoral authority, but it's clear for now that PAS is set to get at least 54 out of 101 seats in the parliament. After Russian invasion of Ukraine, people really saw the support of the free world. European Union, United Kingdom, US were close to Moldova in these past 3.5 years with support, with helping Moldova go through a major economic challenges caused by the Russian aggression of Ukraine, because we saw a dramatic inflation spike, we saw the increase in energy prices here, we saw a massive Russian hybrid warfare against Moldova. And Moldovans really felt the support of the European Union, of the free world, as I was saying, and I believe that played a crucial role.
Adrian Balute, Chief of Staff to President Sandu of Moldova, speaking to BBC News on Monday. Felicity, what's the story?
The story is that the country's ruling pro-EU party won a comfortable majority in elections on Sunday. It beat the opposition, which was comprised of several pro-Russian parties, by quite a considerable margin. And that's come as a bit of a surprise, because there was quite a lot of fears that it was going to be a lot closer than that. It was a real sort of neck and neck in the lead up. Around 1.6 million people cast their votes, which was about just over half of eligible voters, and that's a higher turnout than in previous elections. And it's a big deal. Moldova is a small, poor country that is sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. It used to be part of the Soviet Union, and it was seen very much as a territory that Putin was interested in. Well, you know what Putin's like. He obviously would love to bring it back into the Russian fold and, have his Russian empire and all over again. So it's quite a big deal that Moldova has decided to go the other way.
Yeah. So specifically then, how does this result in the Moldovan election compare against previous years? What sort of swing are we seeing?
So the winning party, they're called the Party of Action and Solidarity, led by the Moldovan president, Maia Sandu, and they won just over half a percentage of the vote, and that's translated into 55 out of 101 seats in parliament, so a comfortable majority.
Harriet.
I think the important context here, though, is that she actually in last year's presidential election, she actually failed to secure a majority in the first round of voting, which was hugely embarrassing for her because she had expected to comfortably win a second term in this presidential election over her pro-Kremlin Socialist Party rival last year. And then she had to go into this incredibly embarrassing second round of voting, largely because she had expected to comfortably win, but then she lost the majority, and this was blamed on an unprecedented assault on the democratic process by foreign forces, which she claimed were pro-Russian criminal groups. So I think, yes, we can look at this as a kind of pro-Western, anti-Kremlin victory in Moldova, but I think it's important to look at what happened last year and the context for this, which was, not so comfortable.
Yeah, and also the process of actually joining the EU, Arion, which is, what her party has stated they would like to do. I mean, it's part of their constitution anyway, isn't it? They voted on it already, I think, but this is another mandate for that. That is a not unbureaucratic process that takes some time. It's not sped up by this vote, is it really?
No, not particularly. And, formally, Moldova has advanced incredibly quickly through the process. It had candidate status from 2023. Accession negotiations opened in June last year. And then you've got this ongoing screening and this total, chapter by chapter work throughout the years since then. So you've kind of got this enormous attempt to push them into the process, but it's not going to happen incredibly quickly because there's this thing called the acquis communautaire, which is the EU's whole rule book on law and judiciary reform and anti-corruption and public procurement and competition rules and all of these things. And you have to meet all of these standards before you're going to be included in the running for, actually joining the EU. So, we're a long way from that. And the fact that Russia has tried to influence the process suggests that they're not going to just stop at that. They really did throw the entire electoral disruption handbook of intimidation and cyberbullying and all of the different approaches that they have at their fingertips at this. And you get the sense that that's not going to be the end of the story for the Kremlin.
Yeah, you were nodding, Harriet. What have we seen the Russians try and do?
Well, like Arion was saying, pretty much everything. So the allegations range from just kind of interference in terms of money influence, and then towards cyber attacks, bomb threats at polling stations, both in Moldova and in other countries as well, like Italy. So the police are talking about this as an unprecedented effort by Russia.
Why would they be threatening Italy? Can people from Moldova vote in an Italian polling booth?
Yeah, so that's what's really interesting about it, actually, that Moldova has this incredibly powerful diaspora that typically votes in favor of this pro-European Action and Solidarity Party, and that are, generally speaking, younger and more inclined to a pro-Western sentiment. So that's the Sandu's stronghold is in the Moldovan diaspora. So that's partly in Italy.
Okay, and what was the reaction, Felicity, of the pro-Russian parties in Moldova to this election result?
It was quite predictable, really. The leader of the pro-Russian Patriotic Electoral Bloc, they immediately declared victory even when the votes hadn't finished counting, and then after that urged protests on the streets. And there were protests, although I don't think they were that huge. But they have also complained that they were kind of mistreated throughout the process. So 2 parties within the pro-Russian bloc were banned from participating on the eve of the election due to concerns about illegal funding. It's quite interesting because the country is actually quite a divided country in many ways. So, on this election, it was like pretty 50-50. There's still a lot of support for Russia within the country. And there is an area called Transnistria, which is lies along the border with Ukraine, that is a breakaway state where about 1,500 Russian troops are still present. And the government of that breakaway territory has frequently requested Russian annexation several times. So this is a victory, but there is still a lot of support for Russia within the territory, and complaints that actually the pro-Russian bloc were not very well treated. And also voters in Transnistria complained that they faced logistical challenges. They had to travel to polling stations a long way away in order to vote. So kind of predictable. And also that's how the Kremlin has also come out and said it wasn't fair.
I mean, you're saying predictable, but do you think that the pro-Russian voices across Moldova are just peddling Kremlin propaganda when they say their vote was suppressed? Or do you detect that some of that is actually going on as well? I mean, both things can be happening, can't it? The Russians can be trying to meddle in the elections, but also pro-Russian voices can be suppressed.
Of course. I think there was probably a bit of both. I think it's a complicated picture. I think it's without doubt that Russia's efforts to kind of to sow the seeds of misinformation is there's definitely evidence for that, and it was very sophisticated. There was this widespread voter buying operation. Voters were bribed to vote for particular parties. Cyber attacks. They were quite big on TikTok, sort of saying that President Sandu had a drugs problem, making up all these lies about her. But there is also genuine Russian sentiment, as there is in other countries like Estonia. I'm sure that goes back to the history and the geography of the region and being part of the Soviet Union. These things are always so much more complicated. I think there is probably a bias in the West that we want to make it look much more simpler than it really is.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about Transnistria, because it is such a fascinating thing. Not that we talk about Moldova much, but this sliver of land in Moldova. It's fascinating because, Arion, when you look at a map, from a Western perspective, from a European perspective, I suppose you can sort of understand why Putin would approach Ukraine from the east. He's on the east. You look at where Transnistria is, and it's on the east of Moldova, but that's on the west of Ukraine. And it's sort of fascinating that there are such strong pro-Russian feelings there.
Totally. I mean, you think about Transnistria, and it sounds like one of those places that's a fictional setting from a Cold War spy novel or something. Yeah. But it's real. It's this thin strip of land, as Felicity was saying, that runs along the Nester River between Moldova and Ukraine. And officially it is part of Moldova, but practically it's been operated as this self-declared republic since 1990, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, Moldova leaned towards independence and closer ties with Romania, but the population of Transnistria, which was heavily Russian-speaking and with this quite large Slavic minority, they resisted, basically fearing dominion from Moldovan and Romanian nationalism. And that led to this brief but violent war that has since been frozen. It's kind of just a tension that has lingered. And part of the reason why, apart from the fact that Moldova is very poor and is still struggling to right itself to meet some of those stringent demands of the EU, that the EU isn't willing to just take them into their fold, is because there's this frozen conflict and they don't want to have to deal with that. So it's sort of quite convenient in the status quo, the sort of relationship that it has right now, neither part of the Russian sphere nor entirely fully embraced by the EU. And I think that's why it's most likely that we're going to see something like the way that it is continuing for some time.
But we've talked about the suppression of pro-Russian sentiment, supposedly the suppression of pro-Russian sentiment in Moldova and Transnistria as well. But what we haven't mentioned is on the flip side, the artificial amplification of pro-Russian sentiment, because a really, really big part of the Kremlin's kind of war on democratic processes in this part of the eastern flank of Europe and eastern flank of NATO, formerly these Soviet countries, a really big part of this is the use of cyber warfare, and like a lot of it fueled by AI now, to flood these places with disinformation. Some of the pro-Russian sentiment isn't in fact rooted in reality, but it's a form of brainwashing effectively. And on top of that, you've also got this massive wave of illicit cash, like Kremlin cash effectively, that's being funneled into these countries, into Moldova, but also Romania, also Slovakia, also Poland. This massive amount of Russian money to promote Russian-leaning opposition parties and Russian-leaning candidates and pro-Kremlin candidates. So this like a triple warfare. There's all this disinformation, and there's all this dirty money, and there's all this just like threats and attacks and cyber warfare and bomb threats too. So it's very difficult to separate a legitimate pro-Russian leaning with what Russia wants there to be, which is in fact an anti-EU leaning.
Yeah, I guess in terms of implications for all of us, Felicity, in a way it kind of comes down to the question of whether this sort of election result makes it a softer target for Putin, because he'll say, like Ukraine, you know, they're against us, they want to be part of Europe, but look, they have all these Russian-leaning people and Russian speakers and stuff, and so therefore this should be in our sights, or whether it makes it harder because, like the Scandinavian countries, they've stood up to Putin and said, this is the language you understand, go away.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a blow to Putin, I think, this election result, and what he does with it or how it influences his thinking about the region. And I think that's what's so interesting. There was a good piece in The Guardian this week, which was kind of a profile about Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, and sort of saying that he's now reaching out to the West. Obviously, he's been this sort of strongman ally of Russia, but he's now sort of trying to kind of play the game between the West and Russia. And, you know, there's talk of should the West offer him a way out of the Russian shadow. So I think it has implications for all our lives, because obviously these countries are kind of on the front line of the conflict with Russia, and what they do and where their elections take them, and what their leaders, you know, whether they sort of lean more towards the Russia or to the West, obviously is a really big deal. And this has huge implications for Ukraine, to have, you know, Russian troops and Russian influence, a hostile neighbour, another hostile neighbour would have been a big deal for them. So I think they're breathing a sigh of relief.
Okay, up next, the return of a 90s icon. It isn't Baby Spice, it isn't Beanie Babies. Find out who after this. Okay, Arion, it's your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A former PM is back in the headlines this week, proving there still must be something in the Blair.
The leaders of the Arab world and Israel and everybody involved asked me to do this, so it would be headed by a gentleman known as President Donald J. Trump of the United States. That's what I want, is some extra work to do, but it's so important that I'm willing to do it, and we'll do it right, and we're going to put leaders from other countries on, and leaders that are very distinguished leaders, and we'll have a board, and one of the people that wants to be on the board is the UK former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Good man, very good man. And
President Trump announcing his proposed Board of Peace on Monday. Not exactly under the radar news, Arion, but the familiar name cropping up there is what you would like to focus on this week.
Yeah, this week we've seen a fascinating and rather unexpected re-emergence of Tony Blair, and 3 stories have come together around him. The main one is the one that we were just hearing about, is that he appears to be being lined up for a role in post-war Gaza, and there's lots of speculation about what exactly that role might be and what he'd do with it. But that isn't his only comeback. His digital IDs are back on the national agenda 20-odd years after he first proposed them. But the third, and perhaps most interesting and under the radar story around him, is that there's been a bunch of articles stemming from reporting done by a couple of investigative newsrooms about the Tony Blair Institute and how it's championing AI, in part potentially because billionaire Larry Ellison of Oracle fame has given him loads of cash. So it's a lot to dig into. I'm sure we'll break it into pieces, but it sort of amounts to this second coming of a man who's sort of never been entirely comfortable being relegated to the political wilderness.
Well, exactly. He's sort of never really been away. And I suppose cynical listeners will be saying, Arion, you just haven't been paying attention if you're surprised by this news. As you say, he has the Tony Blair Institute. The whole purpose of that is to wangle its way into the kind of decisions that governments are making. He's previously been a Middle East envoy, so we knew about that. He has championed, as you say, I mean, to be fair, they weren't digital IDs originally, were they? Under him, they were ID cards, but he's championed that idea for 20 years. So not a surprise. It's just that that's the way the news agenda's gone this week, that his name comes up a lot.
Yes, I suppose so. But it's wild to think that Tony Blair will be in charge of, something like a state in the Middle East where he is entirely persona non grata, except if you're the UN setting him up as a peace envoy of all things. I mean, it's for so long obviously been an intensely controversial thing, but the idea that he'd actually go ahead, as it looks as though Donald Trump was implying, and be the person who's in charge of, yes, a transitional government in Gaza, or at least a body running the place, is astonishing in its own right. But then you add on top of it this whole story about his institute's engagement with the man who was briefly the world's richest man, and I think you've got controversy upon controversy layering up.
I don't know. I mean, Oasis came back, Harriet. Why not Tony Blair?
Well, the truth is, unlike Oasis, Tony Blair's never been unimportant. I think that there's so many strands of this story. So I think just to break it down a little bit, first of all, the Tony Blair Institute is pretty much one of the most powerful and wealthy think tanks in the UK, with astonishing levels of influence and connection and relationships with the current government. And there's also a significant amount of US money that goes into it as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Tony Blair Institute has actually been involved with these plans with Donald Trump and the White House for Gaza for a while now. So Tony Blair he met Trump and Trump's former Middle East envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, for a policy meeting in August. And most embarrassingly, I think this has actually gone quite under the radar, but the FT's done a lot of reporting on this. In the summer, the Tony Blair Institute participated in a project that was led by Israeli businessmen to develop a post-war Gaza plan. And they used financing models created by employees at Boston Consulting Group, which is a big consultancy. And one of the documents, which was reportedly written by a Tony Blair Institute staff member, kind of envisaged kickstarting Gaza's economy with artificial islands off the coast akin to those in Dubai. Now, the Tony Blair Institute later said that its staff had never authored or developed or endorsed any proposal that would involve the relocation or effectively the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. But it was a huge embarrassment for BCG, like an absolutely enormous embarrassment and enormous scandal involving the Tony Blair Institute. So there's that as well. And then the third strand, I think, of this story, which we'll talk about later, is the big, very deep, very intense connections between the Tony Blair Institute and Larry Ellison, briefly the richest man in the world.
Okay. But Felicity, he was, in his pomp, the most popular Prime Minister of our lifetime. He won a record 3 elections for Labour. It's not surprising for him to have a post-PM career and to have some influence. You'd expect that, wouldn't you?
I would actually. He's a divisive figure. Let's put it that way. I think the problem with Tony Blair really is that he sort of became a villain after Iraq, and a lot of the good stuff that he did when he was in power was just immediately forgotten about, basically because of Iraq and the whole, the Chilcot inquiry, and everyone remember the citizen's arrest when some randomo tried to arrest him, and he just became overnight public enemy number one. But he also did a lot of good things, and when he was in power, the Good Friday Agreement went through, and there are some similarities between what happened in Northern Ireland and the peace process and what they want to achieve in Gaza, particularly because it's to do with armed militants and how you get them to lay down their weapons. He has unparalleled network in the Middle East that we've talked about. He has a long experience of dealing with both Israeli and Palestinian leaderships. He 7 years as the envoy of the Quartet, which was the diplomatic group of the US, the UN, the EU and Russia, and that was trying to advance the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I mean, you have to give him credit for even wading into this awful, horrendous conflict in some ways. Why would you want to? So, yes, I do think he has become this villain. I actually think he is a very wily, canny operator and negotiator and diplomat. And I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that he's involved. What I would say is that Larry Ellison is very pro-Israel. He is quite close to the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, which I don't love, has donated heavily to the Israeli military through the non-profit Friends of the Israel Defense Forces. In 2017, he gave that organization the biggest ever donation of $16.6 million. So that is possibly a bit icky, but it remains to be seen. And look where we are with Gaza right now. It's a complete disaster. It's awful. It's horrific. Let's hope something good can come of his involvement.
Okay, so you've all hinted at the Larry Ellison thing. Let's go there then, Arion. Just for people who don't know really who Larry Ellison is, like you may have heard his name, as Harriet said, he's briefly the richest person in the world. Again, was replaced by Elon Musk, who he replaced. But I think a lot of listeners don't really know much about him and his company.
Yes. So Larry Ellison is the founder of Oracle, which has fingers in an enormous amount of pies. And as Harriet says, is one of the biggest tech companies and increasingly powerful due to the fact that it runs and operates lots of data centers all over the world. And those data centers have been the sort of underpinning for a lot of its software, but also he is championing AI and the growth of AI, and so, as it turns out, is the Tony Blair Institute. And so since 2021, this is where it starts to get murky. The Ellison's foundation has pledged at least £257 million to the Tony Blair Institute, and that, again, as Harriet was saying, dwarfs the resources of most UK think tanks. So it's an enormous contribution. And this funding has really kind of transformed the Institute into this global behemoth with like 900 staff in 45 countries, raising questions about whether Ellison's commercial interests, his own personal interests, are now being what the Tony Blair Institute is pushing, because the Tony Blair Institute has a lot to say about the importance of AI to governments around the world. And look, that may also be his personal belief, but those two things being tied together has become incredibly murky. And I think the latest round of reporting shows that there's at least discomfort surrounding his engagement with this organization, if not some sort of out-and-out concerning coming together of those two organizations' interests.
Yeah, and I suppose the Venn diagram of concern, Harriet, is around the NHS, isn't it? That's an area that obviously Tony Blair understands well, having been Prime Minister of this country. It's also a massive data set that if you're a technology company, you'd want to get your hands on.
Yeah, so a lot of people think that the big prize, the big thing that the Tony Blair Institute and Tony Blair and Larry Ellison and Oracle all are eyeing, the big prize is access to our most valuable data, which is our NHS health data sets, which is unique around the world. So the US and the EU, they don't have comparable health data sets. Like the NHS records go back for 70 odd years, and the potential commercial value of that data has been estimated to be up to £10 billion per year. So obviously there are huge commercial interests at stake into who gets access to Britain's most valuable data. And it's no coincidence that what Ellison and the Tony Blair Institute have both been banging on about over the last few years is data. And the Tony Blair Institute published a report recently called Governing in the Age of AI, Building Britain's National Data Library. So they're basically saying that the UK's data infrastructure is fragmented and unfit for purpose. And so why don't we have something like, for example, Oracle come in and take a look and, take control of it? So the Tony Blair Institute is basically suggesting building new digital health records with a system that's run by Oracle, because it doesn't like the fact that the system is run by Palantir, which is a rival of Oracle.
As discussed on a previous episode.
But I think the bigger picture here, if we zoom out a bit, is this very intense personal and financial connection between Larry Ellison and Tony Blair that goes back more than 20 years. And it's not just the connections between Oracle and the Tony Blair Institute, which many previous employees of the Tony Blair Institute have said they're really worried about and they've left because the two organizations are kind of starting to look as though they have merged in very murky ways. but also the personal relationship between these two men. Like, they've been on holiday together. And then the relationship between Larry Ellison and Donald Trump, and the overall look at interest in data and the commercialization of data and AI boosterism as well. So there's so much money and there's so much data that's kind of up for grabs here. And the political influence and this network, this broader network of where politics and big tech have really started to coincide, makes this a story that has implications for not just all our lives here in the UK, but kind of everyone's lives around the world. It's also, I think, worth keeping an eye on the wider Ellison family as well, because Oracle is part of a group that is hoping to buy TikTok's US operations, and it's also financed Larry Ellison's son, his takeover of Paramount Studios, and the family is now targeting Warner Brothers. And if that goes ahead, and if the sale of the TikTok's US operations go ahead, that would leave the Ellison family in charge of TikTok, Paramount, and if the Warner Brothers sale goes ahead as well, also entertainment and news brands like CBS News and CNN. So this is basically, we're talking about the possibility of one family owning and controlling basically the majority of the US information ecosphere.
Okay, but within the Tony Blair Institute, though, Arion, there are lots of ex-civil servants, there are lots of people who have worked for charities and other think tanks. There are people who would say they themselves are not motivated by any of the stuff that Harriet's just outlined. They're there to try and do something good.
Absolutely. And we're talking about kind of these murky comings together of vast organizations and individuals. And we're talking about that partly because we're not the first people to be talking about that. There's been lots of reporting about this, to which accusations the Tony Blair Institute has responded in response to a query from the New Statesman. And they said, the Tony Blair Institute and Oracle are two separate entities. We collaborate with Oracle to help the work we do in supporting some of the poorest countries in the world, and we're very proud of this. TBI does not advocate for Oracle's commercial interests, nor does it advocate for any tech provider. So they have actually responded to some of these allegations, and I think it's worth including that in this piece.
And Felicity, I mean, regardless of whether we see Tony Blair as, Jesus or James Bond villain, someone is going to come along, aren't they, and take the NHS data and turn it into something that actually could be good for the whole world's health. That's the whole point. I mean, yes, you can monetize it, but you can monetize it because it means better drugs, better outcomes for people.
That's the hope. That's the hope. And I mean, that's certainly similar to, the digital ID cards, that there are going to be ways of revolutionizing our healthcare and our information. And obviously there's fears over civil liberties and, who's getting their hands on our data and our personal information. But I mean, it's no secret to say that Tony Blair is an evangelical proponent of AI, as is his son, Ewan Blair, interestingly, who is co-founder and chief exec of Multiverse, which is a tech startup, and he is worth £375 million. So it runs in the family. He's a big fan of AI, and yeah, I mean, you're right. If it wasn't this, it would be someone else who would get their mitts on the data, I'm sure.
All right, well, from AI to Brawleywood. Brawleywood. What does that mean? Find out next. Harriet, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the end of the golden age of Brawleywood?
Shh. Quiet. The trailer from Jurassic World Rebirth, released earlier this year, filmed, Harriet, although you wouldn't know it, about 2 miles away from where I'm sitting right now, which is why we're discussing... Yeah, it's lethal in Hertsmere, which is why we're discussing this news. What is the week's news, Harriet?
Well, this week, Trump has proposed 100% tariffs on films produced outside the US to reverse what he's called the theft of Hollywood. He said that our movie-making business has been stolen from the United States of America by other countries, like stealing candy from a baby. Now, it is true to say that Hollywood is and has been struggling for quite a long time over the past 5 to 10 years, but thought instead that we could use this as an opportunity to talk about how incredible the UK film industry has become over the past 10 years, and how...
So that's what Brollywood is, by the way.
That's what
British
is,
Hollywood.
what
Right,
we're calling,
okay.
what has been called Brollywood, is what I think is passing under the radar, is just how many big studios and big film productions have moved to the UK over the past decade. So we've just heard the trailer for Jurassic World. We've also, Barbie was mostly filmed in the UK. Mission Impossible, Deadpool and Wolverine, the two new Marvel Avengers movies have just wrapped. The first one is just wrapped at Pinewood Studios. So I think that's something that a lot of people might not realize, is that actually Disney, Amazon MGM Studios, Netflix, Warner Brothers, NBC Universal, Sky, all of these huge studios have been filming in the UK and have purchased either sound stages or leases in big studios in the UK.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it, Felicity, just how big a deal the film industry is. In Britain, there was an HBO series called The Franchise, which came out earlier this year, which was directed by Sam Mendes, and Armando Iannucci was one of the showrunners. And it was a satire of Hollywood, but it was set in Watford. And I remember watching it and thinking, this is accurate. Like, it's right that you'd have someone like Himesh Patel and Richard E. Grant on set, but I'm not sure Americans who this series is aimed at know that. I don't think they realise that all the big Hollywood blockbusters are filmed basically in Hertfordshire.
Yeah, I mean, there are loads of studios across the UK. Crownwork Studios is a £450 million complex in Sunderland. There's Pioneer in Glasgow, Littlewoods in Liverpool, I want to say, so kind of across the map. And I imagine part of the appeal is lots of the films, I think it's sort of a testament to kind of English and British storytelling. So Wuthering Heights has obviously been filmed in the UK, and that's going to be released next year. You've got the Chronicles of Narnia coming up, obviously Harry Potter. So a lot of them are... Start
with books written a long time ago, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In England.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the reason why, you know, you're seeing lots of films being made in this country. Also, the fact that we share the same language makes it very, very attractive, as well, of course, of the money, which I'm sure we're going to get onto, and the massive tax credits that you can get. So it actually just makes sense to make them over here.
Yeah, so it's not just tax credits, though, is it? It's that all of us are cheaper. I mean, you see this as well, don't you, with the tech investment that was talked about, Arion, when President Trump came over to Britain a few weeks ago. One of the reasons that large companies want to invest in Britain isn't just because we make it cheaper for them, it's because our people are educated and cheaper than equivalent educated people in America.
Yeah, and not just cheaper and well-educated, but also highly skilled with years of experience. You know, we have these deep craft pools from set carpentry to visual effects and post-production. And that's really useful to blockbusters that want to use an enormous amount of people in these huge sound stages. But also it is significant, those tax incentives, the UK's package of reliefs, which were recently reformed into the Audio-Visual Expenditure Credit, or AVEC. And it makes it really financially attractive for people to come and shoot in the UK. And, you know, so you've got this money saving, this skilled group of people, but also real castles, you know, rolling hills and these outdoor locations that give you the opportunity to provide a whole host of backdrops from, you know, the fantasy of that sort of castle type stuff that's sort of sitting around in the countryside, to then the opportunity to turn parts of the place into, you know, huge rolling worlds, or then use the sound stages to create futuristic environments. So there's an enormous amount of opportunity. But there is a big question about whether it's going to eat into some of the UK's traditional domestic players, you know, the BBCs, Skys and ITVs that have been making lots of UK-based British stories for so long. And now that we're telling these global stories, there's a real question mark over whether they could just ship out next week if there are better tax advantages somewhere else in the world, and particularly if Trump gets his way with this tariff policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe not a good news story for the UK, that bit, Harriet. Yes, there's lots of investment. Yes, there's lots of massive international brands that are being made here. But, you know, the kind of telly that people used to make here, kind of mid-ranking, domestic, not too expensive TV, that's just gone. You know, lots of people that I know that work in TV can't get a job.
Yeah, although I think we have extensively talked about the challenges to the UK, the homegrown television industry on this podcast. I don't think we need to go into it in too much detail. We are specifically talking about the film industry. But it is true that despite the fact that we've got this massive amount of American and big streamer money kind of flowing into the UK, and these huge studios like Pinewood and Shepperton, they're absolutely enormous. And all of these like Marvel productions coming here, and Greta Gerwig's Chronicles of Narnia coming here, and the Harry Potter TV series, and all of these, like some of these most expensive films that will ever be made, like the 2 Marvel Avengers films, all coming to the UK. It is true that a lot of the highly experienced, skilled crews that we have are not getting enough work, because there's all sorts of reasons that we can go into, but effectively the fact that our labor here is cheaper than it is in the US is because most of them aren't unionized in the same way that they are in the US. Studios also don't need to subsidize workers' medical expenses because we have the NHS, but there's all sorts of factors there. But the UK's film sector still is worth £1.36 billion and employs more than 195,000 people. And as we've talked about, we have this incredibly competitive tax incentive system, which offers massive cost savings on big productions. And let's just be clear, the studios care about their bottom line. They do not care about quintessential British storytelling in the same way as they care about the massive cost savings because of these tax reliefs that are offered for filming in the UK. The problem is that despite the fact that the film industry generates so much money for the UK economy, there are still like a largely freelancer-based workforce that is really struggling to find work, is really worried about the fact that this boom over the past 5 to 10 years looks as though it might be heading towards a bust.
And also, Felicity, from the Hollywood perspective, yes, as Harriet says, those studios care about their bottom line, but they also care about their history and tradition. You know, it was a filmmaking town. It was built on movies. If you work for the likes of Warner Brothers or Paramount or Fox or whoever, you know what the history of that is. You probably want to make movies in Hollywood. There's going to be a lot of people welcoming Donald Trump intervening in this way and hoping that some production can come back to America. Do you think it might work?
I'm sure that's true, although I wonder, I mean, like Hollywood and California and Trump don't get on particularly well, do they? So I'm sure the kind of like, you know, it feels very Trumpian to bring things back to America and have, you know, supporting American workers. But, you know, there are so many other problems like the writer strikes and I suppose the fires in Hollywood haven't been great. So there's lots, I'm sure they do want to keep filmmaking over there, but it has been beset by so many different problems. And also you have to remember that film studios in this country have a really long history. I grew up in Ealing, home to Ealing Studios, which was founded in 1902 and is the world's oldest continuously working studio facility for film production.
Is it still there? I didn't know it was still there. That's embarrassing, isn't it?
It's still there. It announced a £20 million expansion plan in 2022.
Okay.
And it had a hand in Downton Abbey, Darkest Hour. I mean, I grew up watching really old black and white Ealing Studios films like Whiskey Galore, I would recommend. So, you know, I'm just trying to make the point that Ealing can rival Hollywood.
But then on the other hand, I mean, Pinewood Studios, it's where Keir Starmer launched his plan for change last year, and he described it as a beacon.
Everyone's favourite thing about Pinewood, that isn't
British
it? Yeah.
Creative brilliance, and the fact that, you know, it's been home to the Bond film since the 1960s, and they announced this massive expansion in 2023 that would have made it the world's biggest studio. But they recently announced that they changed their mind and they're actually building a state-of-the-art data center instead of the original scheme for 21 new stages because of a reduction in global film production. So they're thinking that in 5 years' time, there won't be the demand to justify the outlay of 21 new stages. And this is indicative of a wider pattern that basically the UK film industry and mostly driven by international and US companies, expanded too quickly. And we've now got all of these massive stages all over the UK that have these really humongous leases with big streaming companies, which means that smaller or independent films or British films lack somewhere to film. Even though we have all the studio space, like Pinewood, Elstree, Leavesden and Shepperton, the smaller independent films can't film there because they have these leases with big streaming companies. So unless they shoot entirely on location, small productions have nowhere to shoot. And the work is here, but that means that the highly skilled workforce that we have is starting to demand higher salaries. So that margin that the streaming companies and studios, the money that they were saving on labor is getting smaller. And it won't be long before the tax rebates in Hungary actually increase to make it just as attractive at the UK. I mean, Hungary has already had some substantial productions filmed there, like all the Dune films, for example. So we're going to start losing jobs to places like that. So even though the spend is up, the actual number of shoots is way down. So it kind of looks as though this massive boom, this kind of golden era of Bollywood, could be coming to an end whether or not Trump's proposed tariff takes place.
Yeah, well, where you are, Arion, in Australia, that was kind of the great white hope for film production, wasn't it, about 20 years ago? I think they made the Matrix movies there.
Yep.
What happened?
Matrix movies, I think you had Mission Impossible or two, and then it all sort of vanished. And I think that is the threat of bringing in foreign productions and being kind of the outsourced labor for the Hollywood industry. And I think that, you know, Australia's response has been to kind of come up with Bluey. That's become our major like cultural export in the meantime.
Yeah.
So
it's half your gross national product, I think.
Yep. Yeah. The future is Blueywood. That's it.
On which, my thanks to Arion and to Harriet and to Felicity and to you. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can watch us too, by the way. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.com/subscriptions. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.